Hey there, crewmates! It's Gabe from Nexus Core here with another One Piece meta-analysis. Is going to be me going over the recent FAM Battle Arena. I'm sorry, but I don't know what that means. But it's another big event, and I'm very excited to go over this one because it has a 128 player participation, which means it is quite a bit bigger than the last one that we looked over. But this also includes the recent support from the film starter deck, which means that we might be saying some interesting things with some of the purple decks that have been taking some of those cards. And as well, unlike the first video, this one also comes with the entire player participation. So this is the percentage of every single deck that has entered the tournament, and there is another pie that we'll be going over briefly that goes over the top cut. And big shout outs to Orange Samurai D on Facebook for being able to compile this for me to look at. So the initial thing that we see, quite interestingly, in terms of overall representation from the last video that we went over, Kid at least was in the top cut, the most represented, so I would have at least expected there to be more Kid showing up. However, Kaido actually is the most represented with just over a fifth of the participation here, which is, I believe, about 20, a little over 20, 30 people or so. And followed closely by Zorro, and pretty closely behind Zorro is Kid, but these three are taking up the vast majority, with everybody else taking over 10 or less. So these are definitely the decks to beat for this time, and we can already see as the film deck has come up that we actually do have a bit of Shanks over here, and also King participants. That's a bold move. I'm curious if any of them made the top cut because I kind of want to see those builds. Other things of note we see are Doflamingo is coming in hot after, so I think it's interesting to see what people have been brewing with the Warlord stuff. Then we have Blue-Purple Kaido, then Blue-Purple Crocodile, followed by Green-Red Law, which has seemed to have fallen off since the most recent event that we went over, then Odin, then King, Shanks from the start deck. Kind of surprised that Shanks made it here, just because the Shanks leader is really only for film stuff, so I'm surprised that the film stuff was that good. Then we have Pure Blue Crocodile, and I believe this is Green Red Luffy. So I would like to... Now we're just going to do what we did last time and go over all of the decks that we've seen. So they did cut to top 16, which will be a good indication relative to the last one that we went over. I do not know where this event was held. I apologize for not looking that up. If anybody knows, please let me know down in the comments, but also at least we have the name of the event so we know where to go, and congratulations to everybody that made this top 16. So first, here is our purple deck with Kaido. So the first thing we see is we do have the inclusion of some film cards, which is the Uta blocker. The Uta blocker is quite strong. For those of you who don't know, she's a 4/5. I believe she has a counter of 1000. She has blocker, and when she blocks, you can go Dawn -1 to rest an opponent's character with a cost of 5 or less, which makes her quite strong. Other than that, the only film thing we see is Douglas Bullet, which I actually think makes sense. He is a high-cost card, and he is a decent Dawn sync. I believe his effect is go Dawn -4. And that, I think what's actually good about that is he's proportioned quite well, because he reduces your Dawn by a bit, but not by such a staggering amount. I think there can be problems and issues with this deck where if you go into the board wipe Kaido, which still made its way in even with the additional film support, or with the Kaido leaders, Dawn -6 and 7 effect respectively, you could lose a lot of Dawn for the next turn. Going -4 isn't the worst thing in the world, especially if you have Onigashima on deck. So beyond that, I think everything does make sense. I'm kind of surprised that we're doing 4 ulti with only 2 page 1. If anything, it could be because ulti has 2000 shield and not bad stats. I'm thinking that a lot of the cards in here are because of that. Drake isn't bad, but I think you're running him just because he has a counter of 2000. Kind of surprised by only 3 Borrow Breath, just because it's a 1 cost for 4000. And there isn't another thing that's interesting to me of the events from the film start deck. I would have thought that we would have seen the Lion's Mane one. I forget the full name, but it's 3 cost Dawn -2 to KO something of 5 or less. it's granted it's cost 3 and you have to go Dawn -2, but it seems pretty cheap. And I'm also surprised that there's only 3 Who's Who, just because he seems pretty good for that trigger. But we're also running plenty of low cards. We're running 4 Higurashi and 2 of the low Black Maria, which I think makes sense just to have another low cost card, because you could do Bullet and Maria the same turn theoretically. But yeah, I think a lot of this deck makes sense. They're running it looks like there's a bigger increase in the Doflamingo representation, so running things that can target 4 lowers actually matters in that matchup, which makes sense with the start deck king. But also we're running the the SR King from Romance Dawn, because that can really mess up Zorro Kid in any low to the ground deck. Bullet is great because it knocks down blockers and he hits big, and he's great because he has double attack on a big hitter and can get rid of blockers himself, which makes him a great card. Rush Kaido is Rush Kaido, and Board Wipe is if you really need to equalize. And then the event, I am partially surprised that they're only running 6 defensive events. Brachio Bomber definitely makes sense, especially with the trigger, but I feel like this deck would have wanted at least a little bit more. But because of how high to the high cost this is, I can see why they cut it and are just focusing on characters with counters. So this I think this is a nice list. Next we have Doflamingo with Warlords. So this I think looks like a pretty expected Warlord list. You are running Perona and Doflamingo for the consistency. Doflamingo is a Warlord. You're running the High Warlords, which this is how you are going to take out Kid. Doflamingo being able to get rid of Blocker Law and also be a 7k base. Mihawk doing the same thing and being a 9 base. This is definitely anti-Kid right here. Everything else is resource and recursion. They're running Sentomaru and only 4 of the... and they're running 6 Pacifista, 4 blocker, and 2 of the hitter, which makes sense for the damage. Mihawk is Mihawk. 2 Blackbeard is good just to stall your opponent a little, which is recurable by Moria as well. Then we're running Kuma, who can cheat out Pacifistas in hand, and is great because if you can cheat him out with the Doflamingo leader, you can play him, and then if he gets knocked out, you can play a Pacifista from hand. Obviously, you're going for Hancock in here. And I'm actually very surprised that this deck isn't running any events at all. So this seems like a deck where you're really going to want to get Sentomaru to get your blockers out and just go aggro. I think that's really the biggest thing of note here, is everything really is about blocking with characters and just hoping you can beat face with Doflamingo and Mihawk. So I think this is pretty interesting. Next, we have another Doflamingo list. So this one... there's definitely a few things that are a bit different that I think are worth going over. They've opted to only run 1 Doflamingo, and instead are also including to run 1 Crocodile because they are running events. I think it's kind of interesting that they're opting to run Crocodile, just because Crocodile seems as though, well, he is very good at being, when you are able to reduce these, it just seems as though if you're only running 8 and that isn't the dedicated focus, it just seems like he's largely unnecessary and you'd want to beat face with Doflamingo and get rid of something. But I think it actually does make sense because he hits just as hard, and working with your events I think is good. I'm kind of intrigued by the idea of only running 3 Sentomaru but still opting to run 5 Pacifistas. I think it makes sense, but if you're going to run all of these Pacifistas, I feel like you'd want to cheat them out as quickly as you could anyways, but maybe that's too much of a Dawn investment, and that's the backup plan. They're opting to run 3 copies of Blackbeard just for the control effect of also bouncing, Mihawk for the guard and his decent effect, Boa Hancock for the block and the good effect. If you draw into a lot of Pacifistas, you at least have Kuma to get them out of your hand, so I think this makes sense. And then the usual sculpting we'd come to expect, which is 4 Doflamingo and 3 Perona. I would have expected the 4th one just to see it turn 1, but it's a lot of sculpting, so I think this is really good at cheating out a lot of your 4 costs, and then just being able to hit hard with your high numbered guards. Then we have another Doflamingo, 3 in a row. I think it's pretty interesting that we have Doflamingos in the top 16. It was the 4th highest represented deck, and it seems that a lot of the ones that made it are only in the top 16, which is I think is interesting to see how the rest of the list shapes up. By the way, I have not actually looked at this yet beyond that very, very first pie chart that we saw. So looking at this one, we see quite a few differences. They're opting to run a primarily more aggro build because you can see they're running 4 copies of the Beater Pacifista and 2 of the Blocker. They're only running 2 Centomar, which again seems a little bit weird to me, but maybe they just really wanted to lean into more Warlords than anything so you can use Doflamingo's effect as much as possible. They're running 2 copies of Bon Clay, which I think it's as you can. Bon Clay's effect involves a Baroque work event, and as we can see, there are no events. So I think the real answer here is it's just for the 2K defense, and there's no other reason, which I think does make sense. I think it's why people are running Alvida. I am still just a bit intrigued by the idea of only running 2 Centimar, especially if there are 6 Pacifistas. But there's at least 4 Kuma to circumvent that, and then you also have Boa Hancock, which, as we can expect, so. This deck is also opting to not run any Mihawk and instead run 4 Doflamingo. I can see the logic here. By virtue of being a 7K, it means that you can potentially do something else on your turn. Because if you played Mihawk, that's 9 Dawn. The only thing you could do on a Mihawk turn is Mihawk Law or pump a guy by 1. Whereas if you do Doflamingo, yes, you're not actually getting rid of a card, you're bouncing it, but at the same time, because it's lower, you could potentially play Doflamingo and use your Doflamingo leader's effect. And also, 7 means you can use it earlier, and you only need to give it 1 Dawn to be able to hit Kid, so I can see why. I think this is a pretty interesting build. Next, we have our first Kid list of this deck, which we can already see there's quite a few interesting decisions here. One, they're running Scalpel, which I feel like is very contentious, but yeah, I really don't know about that. And they're also not opting to run any of the 8K kids. I've just noticed this is a very interesting one, and I don't want to undermine the achievement of the person that topped, but I'm kind of curious about the theory here and kind of how it topped in general, just because you don't have the big kid to go around it. You have the start deck one, which is lower costed and can attack and restand itself, but I'm a bit confused. I think this is definitely countering either other kid decks or other. I think this is like an anti-kid kid deck if I had to come up with an idea, because there are definitely ways of getting rid of your opposing kids' blockers. You have Hawkins for the restand, which I think people should definitely be doing. You have Straw Sword, which can rest an opponent's character, which I think is interesting because you can basically force Basil to proc. And then you have a lot of the expected things. You got 4 Killer, you got 4 the other Killer, 4 Bonnie, only 3 Bej. This is a very aggro build because they are opting to run 4 copies of Drake, which can pump your field. So I think this is a more, as I think most of the kid lists we've seen are more aggressive. I mean, more defensive because of it, but this seems to be definitely more geared towards offense because they are also opting to run 2 copies of the Restanding Law just to really hammer home being able to restand all of your characters. So I think this is an interesting take on the build itself. Next, we have another kid list. I think the quick glance, this is the one that we've come to expect a bit more. There's a lot of glare here. I wish people didn't know how to do that. And I just realized the other list wasn't even opting to run the blocker law. So this is really just trying to hammer home a game as soon as you can. So here we, as I said, we're running 4 of the 4 Bej and 4 Killer as the blockers, 4 Bonnie as the searcher. They're running 3 Cat Viper and 4 Izo just to tap things down. They're running 3 Kiku just to, again, keep things tapped down, and Kiku has decent stats. Only 2 Hawkins. I think to some extent this definitely makes sense because if these two do serve a similar purpose, and Kiku, while has 1,000 less power, costs 2 less. So I think I would prefer more Hawkins just because of how good he is in the mirror. But I think these two definitely serve a similar purpose in being able to just cheat out anti. I'm so sorry that I keep getting messenger. I thought I muted this, but I guess not. Let me do that really quick. So, whoopsie daisy. We're going to keep this in because what is professionalism if not the Nexus brand? So, beyond that, a lot of it is stuff we've come to expect. I think I personally prefer going 4 of the 8 kid into 0 of the 7, just because I think 8 kid is more important. But 2 and 2 is something we see consistently, especially if we're running Paradise Waterfall, because Paradise Waterfall plus the 7 kid is a 9k restand, which can definitely hamper your opponent and can be pretty messed up in a lot of situations. Only running 2 of the blocker law, I think this is also a bit more. I think they're more on the high end of the defense and focusing more on countering from hand and wanting to save your Dawn cost for either getting the big guys out or getting how you're going to clean up the game. So I think I can see why you'd only run 2 Law, but I think if you're running this many on places, like there's 3 Viper, 4 Ezo, 4 Killer, with that many, I feel like you'd want to run more Laws, and they're opting to run Raizo for the draw, which I think makes sense. Next, we have our first green-red Law list. I think this one is pretty much what we should be expecting from them. I think the most interesting of note is they are not opting to run any copies of Rush Zorro and instead going the route of running 3 copies of Kid. And they're running 4 copies of the Rest 2, Draw 2. I believe it's You Are My Samurai. That's, I think, the most interesting way of going about this. Everything is super low to the ground. They're taking in a control route by opting to run Robin. I think that makes sense. I think Luffy would likely be one of the centerpieces just because ignoring blocking is good. There's definitely a defense route happening here because you have 4 block Chopper, 2 block Bej. You have Tama, who's a 2k defender. I believe Viper also has decent defense, and then they're also running Radical Beam. So this is definitely I think it's interesting because we're seeing a kid oriented green-red Law list, and I think this is kind of interesting just on that grounds alone, and a lot of Robin as the anti-meta counter, which I do agree with. So I think this is an interesting template to work with. Next, we have our first green-red Luffy list, which we didn't even see in the last video, so I'm curious to see what happens here. So there's not many green cards here to begin with, which I think is kind of interesting. The only green cards are 4 Killer and of the kill a 3 or less character that's rested, 3 Drake, which is the same thing with 4 or less, and 4 of the blocker Law. And for the events, we have Jet Pistol and Red Hawk. I think this is also, to an extent, definitely an anti-meta pick, just because you have a lot of control in the forms of Robin, Red Hawk, and Jet Pistol just to counter lower costed characters, and also Killer and Drake do the same. And then you're also have a very strong aggro package because you have Zorro, you have 4 Zorro and 3 Luffy. You have Law, which can reuse the Zorro, and you have Luffy, which can make itself a 5k once you pay your Dawn. I'm surprised that they're not running any of the 1-cost Nami, which I feel like you'd want just for another low-cost card to give power, but I think they're prioritizing a lot of defense and just being able to play a decent control game. So I think this is a pretty interesting list. Next, we have our next Kaido list. So this is very just punch. This is caveman beatdown, which is why I love to see it. So this deck is opting to run a decent amount of vanillas, which I think is something that makes sense for the anti-Kid match. I don't think Kaido struggles with Kid incredibly, but running cards that help you manage it definitely makes sense. They're running that's not Hold'em. I forget this dude's name. He is the Elephant Gun. But he's a 5/7 vanilla, so he's a 7k that can hit that costs 5, good against Kid. You have I don't know any of these Wano characters' names. Urameshi or something. I've been watching a lot of Yu Yu Hakusho recently. This is the sumo dude, because again, it's a 7 cost that hits for 9,000, so it's a 7 cost that can immediately force a lot out of Kid. And even if they're doing the 7k 7 cost Kid with Paradise Waterfall, it can still hit that combo. They're running Fukurokuju, which is a 6/8. So a lot of these cards are just beat face, and everything is either high cost or guarding. I am very I do have a bit of concern with that because this is a very, very high to the ground deck. And not only is it that, but they're only running two Onigashima, so it would take a while to get there. I feel as though it makes sense that you'd want to play this against Kid. But if that's the case, I feel like we should be cutting a little bit more just for more defensive options, at least more events, and maybe even blockers. But I think just because a lot of these cards are 6 plus, which means if you open like King and Kaido, you don't do anything. There are 2, 6, 8, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 cards in a deck of 50 that cost above 6, which can really hamper it, especially because there's I already forgot, 8, 11, 13, 14, 15, 16 above, that's 6 or above, but an additional 5, 10, 4, 8, 12, so a total of 28. Over half of your deck costs at least 5, which means a lot of the time you're not going to be able to play more than 2 cards a turn, probably even, usually even just 1 if you have like Urashima. But I think Drake again is probably there just for the blocking, so I feel like this deck should probably make some cuts just for the sake of getting the Dawn out. But now that I think about it, the Onigashima doesn't not make sense just because there's very few things that actually return Dawn here. There's Queen, but you get 2 back anyways. King, you get 2 back anyways. But I just think that so many of these cards, actually a lot of these have, the higher ones have shield now that I think about it. So if anything, actually this, the more that I go over it, I think it really is my own personal playstyle and how I approach the deck that's kind of worried, but I think just because of how many things have shield, this kind of makes a lot more sense than I would have expected. So I think this is a very interesting list, and it's also top 8, so what the hell do I know? This is a very intriguing list, and I'm kind of curious about how this, about what this looks like in actual practice. Moving on, though, we have another kid list, and as we can see, this one is another one that leans heavily into the big kids. So we have 3 of the 8 kid and 4 of the 7 ones, and the only events they feel like they need are Paradise Waterfall, which kind of makes sense. If you're able to get 2 kids up, it's doubtful your opponent can do anything. There's a lot of cards here that offer good defense. There's Killer, Apu, you got good counters with the other Killer and Drake. They're opting to run Momonosuke to search some of your Wano targets, Raizo for the draw, Izo for the counter, and also tapping down. And there is Kiku. I think in a list like this, Kiku definitely makes sense more than Hawkins, just because Kiku can be played alongside the 7 kid once you have the 10 Dawn, whereas Hawkins couldn't. So I think this one is actually definitely makes sense, and it's very, very it's with the exception of the 3 block laws and the 3 Diaz Drake, which has counter on it. This is very everything is super low or everything is super high, so I think this definitely makes sense. This is another pretty interesting list. I do like how everybody, or more people, are opting to run Cat Viper and Izo, and we're seeing a lot of cards like that just because they have counter, and being able to tap your opponent's things down just to hit them, I think is a pretty good move in a meta that's that we're seeing. Next, we have our first Zorro list of the day, who, this, I think, this definitely makes sense as a Zorro mid-range list. We have the 4 block choppers, we have the control package in the form of Robin. They're opting to only run one Diable Jambe, which, to bypass blockers, but to circumvent that, they are also running Round Table to reduce things like Kid, anti-meta choices with Red Hawk, which I think makes sense. They are opting to run Saba Odi, which definitely they should in a pure red list just to search things out. Gordon, he has decent shield, and being able to just put away a card you don't want for when you hopefully do want is helpful. You have Rush, Zorro, and Luffy. Robin for control. They are teching in 1 Shanks, which I also think makes sense in matches against Kid and stuff. So I think this list definitely makes sense. And there's a lot of decent searchable cards here just because everything is a Straw Hat. So I like this list. They're running a decent event suite, but the events aren't super high costed, and a lot of them have counters, so it's really good defensively. There's quite a few triggers in this deck as well. We have the 3 here, 2 here, 3 here, and 3 there for a total of 11. And yeah, or 12 once we count Diable Jambe. So this is, I think, a solid list, and is definitely rides that edge of pretty decent defense and pretty good aggro. Next, we have another Zorro list. I didn't even realize I did it because these ones are so similar. I But yeah, these ones are similar. We have 4 Block Chopper, 4 Search Nami, 4 Tama. All of these make sense. So does Nami. Shanks for the kid matchup. Control Robin, Rush Zoro. Usopp because defensive events are rampant. The anti-strike Luffy I think makes sense just because you can reuse Dawn on itself. Sanji I do think makes sense because it's pretty low. Giving it 2 isn't a big deal to give it Rush, especially because Nami exists. And then another event package, they are opting to run 2 Diable Jam because blockers are definitely a thing, but they're not running any round table, which I do think is kind of interesting. But they are also opting to run a good anti-blocker stuff with Jet Pistol, more defensive options with Red Hawk and Radical Beam. So this is another list that makes sense. I do think it's pretty interesting how we're still in the top 8, but I do think it's interesting just how many changes we see amongst these builds. There are so many differences within the same leader, and we're only 1 set in and 5 start decks in, and we're seeing radically different lists with all of these unique techs that I think makes the game very interesting and just makes me happy to want to see what people do with their lists. Next, we have another Kaido list. So this one is more like the first one we saw, where it's a more closer in line with a traditional Kaido list. But with the film support we see, we have 4 copies of Uta as well as 1 copy of Douglas Bullet. Still no copies of the film start deck event that I mentioned, which I do think is interesting, especially because there's only 2 of each of the defensive ones. So this is definitely we are blocking with characters, not events, and I think that's actually pretty interesting and makes sense as we're seeing the Kaido list develop, because so many things in the Kaido list cost so much. Being able to leave even just 1 or 2 Dawn up can be a bit of a problem, but they're running Uta, which I think is good. They're still running Bullet, which I also think is very, very good. I think Bullet is a great finisher for the Kaido list just because a lot of blockers that we see in the meta, like the 5-drop Kid or Queen in a mirror match, aren't really targetable by the effect knockouts we're seeing in Kaido. So being able to at least rest them so you can at least ignore them, I do think really makes sense in how the deck is shaping up. So I do think this is a tight list. Next, we have our next Kid list, and they are also opting to run Scalpel. I don't know if that's a Western idea where this card is better, if there's some secret that we're realizing makes it a lot better than others. They're also opting to run Repel, which I think is quite interesting. Just be there's there I think the thing that's interesting me about Repel and Scalpel is untapping Dawn. I'm unsure of how much it matters with a Kid list just because they already cost a lot anyways, and there aren't that many events that we are running. I think running these 2 makes sense because once Kid is alive, you have 6 cards that can give Kid 4K as well as the 7 Kid to give it additional protection. We have more tap down with Straw Sword as well as Hawkins and a lot of other cards. They are opting to run the promo Kid that has double attack, which I don't personally do, but I think I do see the merit in it just because while the Kid suite is very, very defensive, this also gives you pretty decent aggro just because while he isn't high powered, it is a threatening card that they're going to want to block, and they're going to have to keep blocking it just because they have to get rid of Kid before they can attack into the smaller Kid. And then everything else, though, does make a lot of sense. We have Bonnie and Bej, only 3 killer, which I'm a bit iffy on just because it's a blocker and a good blocker and searchable off Bonnie. But 3 Apu for the defense, 3 Izo for more defense, more aggro with Drake, which I think makes a good pairing with Kid, especially if we want to factor in restanding with Law. So this deck can really do a couple different things. It has a pretty solid aggro game just to push, just because of Drake, Kid, and Law. Being able to restand a high attack double attacker is really good, but you have a very strong defensive suite with the big Kids and the 4,000 protective event. So I think this deck definitely makes sense. And the second place is another Kid list. My God, this deck doesn't stop. This deck is just going full extreme with 4 of each of the big Kids just because Honestly, I do see the merit in that because honestly, the 7 drop kid is quite good on its own. So even if you don't see the 8, just having a 7k, 8k attacker that restands itself defensively with blocker, pairing it with Paradise Totsuka makes a lot of sense. And we have a lot of low cost cards to get advantage. Momo can get us Raizo, Izo, Kiku, and I believe Cat Viper is a part of it. I don't think he's just Mink. And then we have Bonnie for everything else, and a lot of things that are exist as blockers or defensive options. So I can actually see the merit in this. I I'm interested in the decision to not run any Hawkins, but if we're running this many sevens and eights, I can see why. And I think both big kids effectively, if you're running Hawkins to go anti-kid, they both serve the same purpose, but also functioning, doing what the deck wants to do with high defense blocking and making it so that your opponent can't really do anything. So I think this list definitely has a lot of merit. But the winner of the event is Blue Purple Kaido. This is the only Blue Purple Kaido we've seen in the list so far, and it managed to win the event. That is very interesting. And as we can also see, not only is this list running more film cards than the ones we've seen so far, they're also doing it when they have access to not just purple, but blue as well. So this is arguably had the most amount of options, and they're still opting to run in the film stuff, which I do think is very interesting. So I'm actually surprised we didn't see any Guild Tesoros in the previous list, just because I think just a free draw too without any discard is really good in a purple deck, even though you have to go Dawn -2. But I think that makes sense with Blue Purple Kaido just because he can get you your Dawn back. You could theoretically just attack with Tesoro into a character and refund one of the Dawn you spent for the draw. We have Drake for guarding. We have Mihawk also for consistency and guarding. The film stuff, they're also opting to run Buena Festa, and I actually see the merit in this because there are a decent amount of film cards. There's 4 of Uta, there is 2 Douglas Bullet, and 1 of the event that I keep mentioning that lets you KO something of 5 or less. So they are running 8 with Guild Tesoro non-Buena Festa film cards, but also he has 2,000 shield, so he's a good defensive option in a Kaido list already, which the deck does want. And then a decent amount of big cards. 3 Rush Kaido I do think makes sense. Board Wipe if you need to equalize. Then we have Bullet for the resting, and I do think it's interesting how much consistency we see in running 2 of each Kings as opposed to 3 and 1 or 4 and 0. But I think it just makes sense to be able to target multiple different matchups because from what I am aware, the One Piece card game is best of 1 as opposed to 2 out of 3 without sideboard. So in that case, it does make sense. And then Law, just because it's a low blocker card. And even though Kaido can refund his own Dawn, they are opting to run Onigashima, which I actually do think definitely makes sense with a list like this, just because there's a decent amount of high cost cards and decent amount of Dawn minusing cards, because you have two. You have the 2 bullets that go -4, 3 Kaidos that go -5, and the 4th Kaido that goes -6, and then a couple of other incidental ones like Guild Tesoro and the Kings and Queen. So this deck, and also the one event that I had mentioned. So I think this is a very interesting deck, and it's definitely a list where you are going to do a solid control game. Uta is control in her own way, just because while you're not doing it on your turn, tapping down something is definitely helpful to attack into it to fuel Kaido's own effect. You have all of these big guys, so you're definitely slowing your opponent down a little bit with a lot of characters to block with, while I think this is a deck where you're going to end up, just because of the blocking you do, the setup you get, and the tapping down and KOing you do with this deck, is one where you're going to end up seeing 2 or 3 of the big dudes out just to beat face like that, which I think is makes sense. And I think this is a very interesting list, and a big congratulations for the person for not only winning a 128 person event, but also doing it with the only deck in the top 16. So absolute congratulations to, I don't want to butcher their name. Again, I'm an American that only speaks English, so I apologize. So now we're just going to do a big end of video wrap up. So we also have the breakdown of top 16. And as we can see, there is a huge difference between this and the list itself. So many of the 128 didn't make it to top 16. There wasn't we didn't see the blue crocodile, we didn't see Shanks or King, we didn't see Odin, we didn't see blue purple crocodile. So many of those just did not make it to the top 16. And even though Kid was only the third highest in representation, he was still the absolute highest in representation within the top 16, with almost a third of top 16. So I believe that breaks down to, I think this 31 with this is like between 5 and 6 decks. So Kid is the deck to beat. I think what's interesting though is relative to the last one we see a big decline in green and a huge incline in blue and purple. I think there was either one blue in the top 16, if there was any at all, but now we're seeing Doflamingo, so the Doflamingo list is ironing out. We're seeing a lot more purple now that I think people are starting to realize what purple wants to do, as well as I think some of the film stuff is helpful. Zorro is really fallen a bit relative to the last list. I think Zorro is strong, but the problem is there are so many decks in the meta that just counter Zorro incidentally that he gets just knocked down. If you're playing Kid, you are likely running Hawkins, and if you're not running Hawkins, having big Kid on board is anti-Zorro in its own right, because the 8-drop Kid isn't even a blocker, so Rush, Luffy, or Diablo Jam doesn't even bypass that, and you still have to hit 8k to begin with. Purple just kills them outright. Green has Hawkins, as I said. There are a decent amount of control options in blue, but also a lot of the blues we've seen are running blockers and with the Pacifista, so decently statted ones, and being able to cheat out decently sized cards is very helpful. So Zorro really doesn't do great against all of the matches, but also green also has access to things like Killer and Drake, and we're seeing a lot of Drakes in the list. So being able to just outright knock out Zorro, I think Zorro is a list where even though he's pretty strong on paper, he does not last long. And if you are able to slow them down, and you don't even need to slow them down quickly, but just slowing them down means they can't really do anything. So I think Zorro definitely just he's not doing he hasn't been knocked down just because he's bad, but because this isn't an environment for him to be good. I think he is very strong, but the other decks just have so many answers to him that you're going to run anyways, because those answers answer other decks. Zorro loses because cards you want to run for non-Zorro matchups still work against Zorro even incidentally. Law has also been dethroned, I think, for similar reasons, because Law's effect requires him to have 5 on the board in a heavy control meta where you have direct KOs with Kaido, or even stuff like Basil Hawkins or Killer Kiku and so on, make it so that you can't use his effect. And if you're not using his effect, you just don't have, and starting with 4 life, you are really getting hurt. Luffy, I think, is in a similar position, but he didn't make it into the last video, so I think some aggressive options have been helping. And then we have the green-purple Kaido, which I think definitely has been helped by the event. And I think, not to say I told you so, but I do think what I said in the initial meta-analysis did prove to be true, where the early metas can definitely be shaped by the quick and straightforward decks. Stuff like Zorro is pretty easy to figure out because you just get the lowest to the ground best attackers relative to that and bypass your problems with the control suite for stuff like that. So they didn't need to figure anything out, because rush decks rush to begin with. You have to figure out your answers to what answers you, but you still have your game plan, whereas control decks need to know what they are controlling against and how to control them properly. But as we are seeing that, we are definitely seeing a rise in purple, but also purple does run the unfair advantage of being the only color with 2 start decks worth of support as opposed to 1. So there are cards that have definitely been helping purple that other decks just don't have a fair advantage to. But of course, as we should be expecting, Kid is the deck to beat right now, just because this is such an intense amount of the pie. And as I said, a lot of the control decks are odd in this case, because they wind up being kind of gatekeepy in that they are able to control the things below them. But Kaido can't really control Kid, because the only thing that bypasses Kid directly is the 10-drop Kaido, which again is there, but that's not a card you're going to want to run 4 of. And Other than that, things can rest blockers or KO low to the ground, but you can't directly bypass Kid. And if you're running a lot of characters with counters or the big events like Repel and Punk Gibson, I think the defense definitely makes a lot more sense. But I do think probably one of the most interesting things that we've seen here is just how much uh, higher Doflamingo got. And I'm glad to see that. I'm glad we're putting some respect on Doflamingo's name, and that deck is another, because from the last list, blue was suffering. I think I had mentioned that blue had really been hurting, but this kind of proves me wrong. Blue really made itself known in this tournament, which I think is very interesting. It's it's as represented in the top 16 as mono purple Kaido, and not that, and the percentages make it seem a lot higher, but remember this is top 16, so the difference between these two is largely just one or two decks, I believe. But seeing this difference, I think the meta is, this is going to be pretty clear for the time being until set 2 comes out. There's just, I think by this point, with the amount of tournaments we've had, and of, well, we haven't had many large scale ones. Of the large scale ones we've seen, we know for sure Kid is the deck to beat. Kaido is slowly but surely being cemented in how it needs to be built, and then Doflamingo is doing good, and then everything. I think most decks have been cemented in what a build, quote unquote, should look like, but some things just have weaknesses. Not every deck is going to thrive in every environment, so I think by this point in the game, after seeing these two large ones across a couple of weeks, this is probably what we can expect the meta to look like, with very minor changes here and there. Maybe there'd be an even bigger fall from grace for some of the red things and a bit more representation in purple as people experiment with more of the film cards. But for now, that is going to wrap up the video. I hope we get another one of these soon to see what happens. And I'm actually glad that the One Piece card game is spacing out its releases. I don't believe the set 2 comes out until either end of October or early November, so there aren't many products that will be upshifting the meta. So we're definitely going to see tweaks in the pie here and there relative to the events, but this is largely what we should be expecting. So thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Hopefully it will be out soon, but because there aren't a wide amount of products coming out, and I don't have a lot of people to play with. Most of what I can do is meta-analyses, a couple of card reviews here and there, and deck profiles. So please, if you've made it this far, please give me video ideas of what you want to see, because I want to keep making videos. It's not that I haven't had the time to. I am running out of ideas as we are running out of product to go over. But that is going to wrap it up. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.